Hello and welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. I have never played the Elden Ring video game. I should have. I rank Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne as two of my favourite video games of all time after all. But Elden Ring is huge, and I know I simply wouldn't have the time to play it. But I have watched a lot of footage of people playing it online, and I was content with, or at least resigned to, the idea of enjoying the lands between through their experiences. Then Steamforged Games asked if I would like to check out an early review copy of their board game adaptation, Elden Ring Realm of the Grafted King, and that changed everything. Not least the amount of available space on my board game shelf. Steamforged Games have already taken a crack at adapting a From Software title, and the result, Dark Souls the board game, sits comfortably in my list of top 10 board games, so I couldn't wait to see what they could do with the scope and scale of Elden Ring. Make no mistake, this game is huge. There are 3 entry points to the game. The first is Realm of the Grafted King, a gigantic box containing 54 stunning miniatures, including a choice of 4 Tarnished player characters, over 70 map tiles, more than 1,200 playing cards, and a campaign that will keep you playing for, at a guess, based on my experience, around 50 hours or so. This is the box I received for review. And what I received is exactly what you will get if you purchase at retail, with one exception. This box art, with the slick gloss finish, was a Kickstarter exclusive. The regular release features something more suitable for a retail environment. Besides that, there are 2 smaller expandalones, the Weeping Peninsula and Stormvale Castle. These sets work as standalone games if you want to test the waters before jumping in with both feet, or you can use them as expansions. They each contain around 20 miniatures, including player characters, 2 that appear in Realm of the Grafted King and 2 that don't, and all of the materials necessary for a replayable campaign that offers in excess of 20 hours of gameplay. Combine these sets with multiple expansions and, well, it's big. It's also incredibly impressive. Intricately designed, with different game modes that overlap and intertwine, weaving a story that evolves based on your decisions, yet constructed in such a way that players can drop in and out at will, respeccing their character, or even changing to a completely different character class on a whim. Frankly, I have no idea how you even begin designing something like this. Something so grand that truly attempts to capture open world exploration, narrative adventuring, and skill-based tactical combat all at once. And yet, Steamforged Games have managed to do it. Sort of. As with anything that attempts to do so much, some areas of the gameplay are more successful than others. But frankly, I am in awe. I set up Elden Ring on my kitchen table one bright chilly morning and I started playing. I played all that day. I woke up early the next morning and played all that day. And the next. I left the game set up on my table for a week, playing it as much as I could. Family meals were relegated to the table in the lounge. For a short while, my daughter was able to join me for some 2-player games, but predominantly I played solo. And over the course of my gaming sessions, I made it through about half of the campaign. As I played, I thought to myself, how can I review this? How can I review this beautiful mess of interwoven systems? Even an unboxing of the contents would take about 30 minutes. In fact, I know people, especially painters, like to get good views of the miniatures for these games, but there are so many and they are so varied, I have decided to put up a separate video next week so I can show them all off in 360 without causing this video to drag. Don't worry though, you will still see plenty of them in the video. It's just they're so nice they really deserve their own time to shine. As for this review, I decided there really was only one way to do it. I would share my story with you. I'll keep it spoiler free. The first thing to do is select your Tarnished. In the Grafted King there's a Vagabond, a sword and board tank who can soak damage and deflect it and who deals moderate damage in attack. There's a Samurai, a fast melee character who can often combine movement with low powered strikes, adapting combat stances and nimbly dancing out of dangerous situations. There's an Astrologer, a type of wizard who can use glintstone magic and has the ability to chain attacks together to make efficient use of actions. And then there's a Prophet, another magic user who can make devastating attacks and heal, but they crumble like cracker bread under a stern look from even low level enemies. Elden Ring is a cooperative game for up to 4 players, and as with any co-op game, you can control more than one character if you want to, but I decided to play true solo, just me controlling one character. Naturally, I chose the Vagabond. Each character has a wedge of starting cards that you need to arrange on a player dashboard, which is one of the few components in the game that I would consider to be of insufficient quality. And here, fans of Monster Hunter, also from Steamforged Games, will feel quite at home, as they will find a lot of this very familiar. There is a profile card that shows your starting equipment and initial stats, health, focus points, which you spend to perform special abilities and spells, and your combat hand size. You use one of the nifty tri-dials to record these stats because it's not a Steamforged Games title without some spinny dials. Each character starts at level 1 and has a level 1 card specifying their class skill. The Vagabond is OP as heck, as whenever he fully defends an attack, the attacker takes 1 wound. I have actually managed to break some combats with that ability. More on that later. Related to your level is your starting quest. Each Tarnished has 15 quests to complete, and each one is different. The Vagabond's starting quest involves resolving hardships while exploring the lands between. The quest is completed after resolving 3 hardships, at which point this quest is discarded and you are directed to take the next quest from the Vault, which is a special deck of secret cards that you will gain access to through making particular choices, undertaking quests, and completing scenarios. Eventually, completing a quest will direct you to level up, and through this campaign it's possible to reach level 4, with each level granting perks such as an enhanced version of your class skill or improved stats. Under the dashboard, you have 4 slots. The first is for armor. Every hero starts with some kind of armor, and the interesting thing is that armor doesn't often block damage itself. Instead, it gives you some kind of ability that relates to blocking damage. This Vagabond armor gives you a bonus when you discard cards to block an attack. It's OP as heck. And then you have 2 weapon slots, and this is really neat. Each character must always have equipped 2 weapons, or 1 weapon and 1 shield. Each equipped item lets you include a certain number of cards in your combat deck, selected from the list printed on the item card. This longsword, for example, lets you add 6 cards, 3 shove and 3 heavy strike. However, once it's upgraded to level 1, you can select your 6 cards from 3 shove, 3 heavy strike and 3 light strike. Similarly, the heater shield lets you add 6 cards, 3 block, 2 deflect and 1 parry. But as it upgrades, the list of available combat cards grows longer and you will have to choose which ones to add or drop. Some weapons also let you change the total number of cards in your deck, so you could have a smaller deck to more reliably get the most powerful cards into your hand, or a larger deck that offers more tactical flexibility. In this way, you can customize your movesets to suit your playstyle. You can even reset your combat deck before battles, making it possible to adjust to whichever threats you are about to face. Once you have made your combat deck, you shuffle it and place it in the combat slot at the top of the dashboard. Each Tarnished also starts with an attribute deck. This deck is, and will always be, exactly 10 cards, and will be used throughout the game in place of dice. Each attribute card features different symbols in different combinations, illustrating what your character is good at. The Vagabond is a chonky boy, so he has lots of strength symbols on his cards. This lets him perform powerful strikes and complete feats that require physical power. The other symbols represent dexterity, intelligence, faith, and then there is a torso symbol, which is a common symbol representing standard exertion without any particular talent. Each Tarnished starts with a unique deck, but over time you can customize it, removing the weaker common symbols and replacing them with more powerful specializations, or swapping in new types of symbols that you will need to use the different weapons you will find on your adventure. For example, if our Vagabond was to find a sword that required dexterity as well as strength, we could rebalance our attribute deck accordingly. Finally, you need a few tokens. 1 class token, used for marking your current location or map tiles, and then a flask of Crimson Tears and a flask of Cerulean Tears. And here, I have a real bone to pick with Steamforged Games. For a company of their caliber, who put so much care into the quality of their game materials, forgetting that colorblind people exist is particularly egregious. Look at this. I am classed as colorblind, and while I can often differentiate colors, I struggle with certain hues under certain lighting conditions. Telling the difference between these 2 tokens is almost impossible for me. And this isn't the only instance of this in the game. For example, material cards used for crafting consumable items are differentiated by shapes of different colours. But the worst example is on Tarnished combat cards, where the colours of the squares on the attack icons mean different things. The orange squares mean the attack hits all the enemies in that area, but the blue squares mean you select just one enemy in that area. It's hugely important to be able to identify the difference easily. But I digress. Our Tarnished is ready for action. The other slots on the dashboard for talismans, traits, buffs and effigies of the martyr will come into play later on. For now, we can begin our adventure. Elden Ring makes use of a branching campaign structure, where your decisions determine which scenarios become available and when. However, the first few scenarios are sequential, designed as a kind of tutorial, and that's a great idea because each scenario in the campaign will feature one of 5 distinct modes of gameplay, and it's a lot to learn. First, you're introduced to the narrative scenarios. Your Tarnished awakens in the stranded graveyard and must find a way out of the gloom. This is your standard choose-your-own-adventure style narrative. You read a passage of text, then you make a decision which directs you to another passage of text. The story evolves, you face some challenges, or actually you don't yet, and eventually you make it out of the graveyard. This sets the scene beautifully, but also immediately introduces the idea that your decisions have weight. You cannot die here, you cannot lose this scenario, but when you begin you are asked to set aside 3 objective tokens. As you make certain decisions, you may be asked to discard one of those tokens. Depending on how many tokens you have left at the end of the scenario, you may or may not be told to take a specific card from the vault and shuffle it into the Hardship deck, which we will learn about momentarily. Is that card good or bad? You don't know, and you won't know until it pops up later in the game. In later narrative scenarios, the decisions become even more important, locking specific content from you so you won't be able to access it for the rest of the current playthrough. When you meet an NPC, will you fight them, befriend them, or trade with them? Each option will direct you to take cards from the vault. Maybe you will get a new weapon if you befriend them. Then again, maybe that weapon will be lost to you forever, and instead you will get a series of event cards that you will seed into the event deck so you can meet your new friend in the future. On completing the stranded graveyard, you are also directed to take map card 1 from the vault. Map cards represent the scenarios available to you, and you can pick any one of them to play at any time, with one exception. Sometimes you will find map cards that are rune locked. You will not be able to play these scenarios until your Tarnished has enough runes, and you only get runes by completing scenarios. So parts of the game are gated off to prevent you from getting ahead of the narrative or wandering into areas you aren't prepared for. At this stage, you don't have any runes, and you will only have one map card, so your next scenario has to be First Steps. This is an exploration scenario, where you get to wander around a map made from hexagonal tiles, and for my money, this is the weakest part of the game. It all works, and I do enjoy it, it's fun to see the world expand, but it doesn't feel like there's any real challenge here. You will rarely fight anything, and fights are often avoidable. Random events are infrequent, and quests fairly easy to accomplish. It's like a walking simulator where occasionally you are presented with easy challenges, but most of the time you are just flipping tiles to see what's there. To set things up, you need to follow the instructions in the scenario guidebook closely, and you start by creating the map tile stack. The first exploration scenario lists all of the tiles that should be in this stack, but at the beginning and end of each subsequent exploration scenario, you will be instructed to add or remove tiles from the stack, representing your Tarnished exploring new areas of the map. With the stack created and shuffled, you then randomly draw one of 6 starting tiles, place it on the table with an active Site of Grace token, and place your Tarnished there. The tiles, incidentally, are lovely. They are evocative of the artwork from the map in the video game, and it's a pleasure to watch the world grow as you lay each tile on the table. As you wander around, you will feel like you want to explore these places. What's in that wood? Who would live in that settlement? However, you aren't just wandering aimlessly in this land. Each scenario will list a number of Guidance of Grace cards, each of which presents a particular challenge, and in most cases you will have to complete all of them in order to win the scenario. First Steps, being a tutorial mission, presents you with several easy Guidance of Grace quests intended to familiarise you with interacting with locations on the map tiles, gather materials, collect some Stakes of Marika, and resolve some hardships. On your turn, you get 3 actions from a choice of 6. 3 of these are fairly mundane and rarely used. The trade action lets you swap materials or consumables with another Tarnished on the same tile. This may be necessary so a player has all of the components necessary to craft something with the craft action. When you use the craft action, you discard materials that match the materials listed on one of your recipes and then take the relevant consumable. You can't make anything unless you have a recipe, and to get a recipe, you must trade in the correct materials with a merchant. It's a frightfully annoying system. You have to randomly acquire materials until you have a good mix of colours and symbols, then you have to find a merchant, and then you have to hope the recipes he is offering match up with the materials you have, as the merchants in each scenario offer something different. As materials are perishable and must be discarded at the end of a scenario, I have found it surprisingly difficult to line up the ducks necessary to make anything other than staunching boluses and glowstones. Then you have the flask action. This lets you flip your Crimson Tears flask to restore all your hit points, or your Cerulean Tears flask to restore your focus points. Most of the time though, you are going to be doing the other 3 available actions. You can explore, which lets you draw the next map tile from the stack and place it attached to your current tile. Orientation of the art doesn't matter, but most tiles have some barriers, which are impassable, and you are not allowed to position a new tile so a barrier is blocking access from your current tile. Once a tile is placed, you add any location tokens. If there is already a tile adjacent to your current tile and it isn't blocked by a barrier, you can spend an action to move to it. The only wrinkle here is if there is a hardship token on that tile, you must exhaust that token, which doesn't cost an action, and then immediately draw a hardship card. Hardship cards get progressively more difficult as the campaign continues, and most of them are split in 2. You resolve the top half if it's the daytime, and the bottom half if it's the nighttime. And this is pretty straightforward. The hardship has a challenge value, and then a series of icons that can be played to match that challenge value. You get to draw 2 cards from your attribute deck, and you can apply each icon on those cards once, totaling the scores of all of the icons based on the relevant score on the hardship card. For example, I have drawn a rock slide. Let's assume it's nighttime, which means the challenge value is 6. I draw my first attribute card and it has 3 common symbols. We can see on the hardship card that each common symbol contributes 1 to your total, so we have scored 3 so far. We then draw our second card. The strength symbol contributes another 2. But the other symbol is a faith symbol, and faith isn't depicted on the hardship card. Have we failed? No. Elden Ring uses a sort of reverse wildcard system, where any attribute symbol can be played as a common symbol, so our faith symbol actually contributes an additional 1 point, taking our total to exactly 6. Unfortunately, this particular card doesn't have a reward, but succeeding means we don't have to suffer the penalty of losing a material card. The final action available during exploration scenarios is Interact. For one action, you can pick any one active token on the tile and resolve it. I'm not going to go through them all, but these will commonly be materials that let you draw from the relevant deck of material cards, stakes of Marika, which you can subsequently use to revive yourself if you are killed, effigies of the martyr that you can use to join other Tarnished while they are in combat, and sights of grace that you use to reset your health and focus dials, although this will also reset all of the hardship and material tokens on that tile and any adjacent tiles. Many exploration scenarios also have special locations, like dungeons that you first have to find a stone sword key to interact with. Interacting with these locations may add new tiles to your tile stack, or may let you take more map cards from the vault. For example, unlocking a dungeon may let you take on a boss battle against the creatures hidden within. The only time you aren't allowed to interact with a location is if there is an active enemy counter, in which case you must defeat the enemy first. This means you have to remove your character from the map, you replace your miniature with your class token to mark your location, and then you flip to this section of your encounter booklet indicated in the scenario rules and play a combat encounter there. The rest of the game carries on without you. Tarnished on the map will continue to explore and interact with locations, but whenever it gets around to your turn, you will play a round of combat. Only once the combat is over will you return to the map to once again explore the lands between. And yes, each player gets their own encounter book. And yes, it could be the case that up to 4 players are each running their own combat encounter on their own A4 booklet all at the same time. That means that during exploration scenarios, the game is an absurd table hog. You have 4-player dashboards with all of the associated cards, 4-player encounter books, the map you are exploring with other decks of cards and tiles surrounding it, the scenario book, the rules book if you need to reference anything, and then you have the tray of cards and the trays of miniatures, which are going to end up stacked on the floor even if you have a 6 by 4 gaming surface like I do. To be clear, the combat in Elden Ring is incredibly clever. It's a thoughtful puzzle game taking elements from other Steamforged Games titles like Dark Souls, Monster Hunter and RuneScape Kingdoms, and swirling in a few new twists. I like it a lot. But when you are playing an overland adventure game, something like Runebound, there is something to be said for quick, fast-paced combat. Settling an encounter with 1 or 2 dice rolls or card flips would keep the game moving, and it may have made Elden Ring a bit cleaner and faster if it had adopted a system like that and reserved the combat encounters for when you go into dungeons or fight bosses. But First Steps doesn't have any combat encounters until the very end, so before we talk more about that, let's get back to exploration. After finishing your turn, unless you are in a combat encounter or have just returned from a combat encounter, you have to draw a weather card from the relevant weather deck. Explorations normally start during the day, so you draw a day card and follow the instructions on it. Almost all of these cards say time passes, which means nothing at all happens. If a deck runs out or a card you pull tells you to, you start drawing from the other deck instead. If both decks are exhausted, you fail the scenario. For the most part, the weather decks are a doom clock, ticking down to your failure. However, occasionally you will draw a card that says a random event occurs. This doesn't happen nearly enough for my liking, but this is the fun bit. The event deck initially contains only basic events, but as you make decisions throughout your adventures, you will add or remove cards with particular story beats. This is how it's possible to stumble across characters you met previously, allowing you to continue quest chains that may have started in a completely different scenario a long time ago. Having resolved any events, the next player takes their turn. And this will continue until a player dies and there are no stakes of Marika available to revive them, which will never happen, the weather decks run out, which will never happen, or all of the scenario objectives have been fulfilled. Honestly, there is not a lot of threat here. Hardships aren't particularly punishing when you fail them, events happen very rarely, and the combats are generally very easy. Even if one feels like it might be a challenge, you can often summon allies with some spirit ashes, or ask another Tarnished to join you to even the odds. So overall, these sections of the game feel rather relaxed. You can go into cruise control and treat it mainly as a way to stock up on consumables and stakes of Marika, both of which you will need for the tougher combat encounters later on. Speaking of which, you will have your first combat at the end of the First Steps scenario. Each Tarnished will face their own challenge alone, and combat is weird. It's highly abstracted, a positional procedural puzzle, and while it does provide opportunities to push your luck, it rewards skill far more. The scenario will tell you which page of your encounter book to turn to, and I'm not going to spoil any of the later fights, so we are just going to look at the combat encounter for First Steps. To set up the fight, you look at the list of enemies, and then you find the right miniatures and the associated cards. It's important to note the letters for the cards because they are different. That means every single enemy you meet will have a different set of actions available to it, even though the miniatures may be identical. Place the enemy miniatures on the combat grid as indicated on the diagram in the encounter book, and then use lettered tokens to track which one is which if required. Next, you refer to the initiative cards limit. This is the maximum number of Tarnished initiative cards that can be included. Normally, each Tarnished will contribute a single initiative card, so if the initiative cards limit was 3, up to 3 Tarnished could get involved. However, if a Tarnished is fighting alone, they usually get 2 initiative cards. This first fight is an exception. It's the only fight in the game with a limit of 1, meaning you can only add 1 of your initiative cards to the mix. Next, you place any Tarnished miniatures involved in the combat onto the combat grid. Placement is important, and it's going to take a little while to get used to it. You will notice that the combat grid comprises vertical lanes and horizontal rows, and is divided in the centre by a red battle line. Enemies are always on the top part of the grid and cannot venture into the bottom part. Tarnished are always on the bottom part of the grid and can never venture into the top. The vertical lanes define the relative positions of the fighters. Most enemies will attack the first Tarnished, or every Tarnished, in their lane. So if you move to the left or right, this would represent sidestepping, dodging, or circling your opponent to get out of range of their attacks. The really clever bit relates to the rows. The Tarnished side of the combat grid usually has 3 rows, and those rows do not indicate how far away you are from the enemies as you might expect. Instead, the rows define the Tarnished combat stance. If they are in the bottom row, they are in a defensive stance. If they are in the central row, they are in an adaptive stance, and if they are in the top row, they are in an aggressive stance. Sometimes the rows will have different stances associated with them, and the rows on the enemy side of the board may also have special rules. On this particular battle grid, only the enemy row closest to the battle line has a rule: critical hit. That doesn't mean that enemies in that row will make critical hits, it means that they have exposed themselves to a critical hit, and the Tarnished will gain an advantage when attacking, even if they aren't in an aggressive stance themselves. Bearing all of this in mind, you place the Tarnished characters. Let's put our Vagabond in an adaptive stance. Then each Tarnished player draws from their combat deck up to their hand limit, as indicated by their tri-dial. Finally, the initiative cards are shuffled and laid out ready to begin the first round of the combat. The initiative cards are read from left to right and indicate the order in which the models activate. In this case, the Wolf will move, then the Godric Soldier, and then our poor Vagabond. Fortunately, we are in an adaptive stance. That means before anyone activates, we are allowed to move one of our initiative cards one space left or right in the initiative order. Let's move to the left so we activate before the knight. And yes, I really like this initiative system. It reminds me very much of modern Warhammer Quest games, Blackstone Fortress and Cursed City. Next, the Wolf activates. Its card is divided into 3 actions which it performs in sequence. The top row shows that the Wolf will attempt to hit the first Tarnished in its lane for 3 points of damage. The cross symbol means if it does this, it will then stop activating. Its turn is over. If it can't make that attack, which it can't because it doesn't have a valid target, it will move forward 1 space. After moving, we look at the second line. This symbol means the Wolf will move up to 2 spaces left or right towards the closest Tarnished. So our Wolf moves 1 space to the left. Then we look at the third row, which indicates the Wolf will attempt to attack again, this time for 2 points of damage. It's time for us to defend. Luckily, the Vagabond is very good at taking hits thanks to his knight armor and heater shield. We actually have 2 defensive cards in our hand, a deflect and a block. Now when you are taking damage, there are 2 things you can do. Firstly, you can discard cards. Every combat card, even the attacks, have a defensive value in the top right. You can discard any number of cards from your hand, totaling the defense value and then deducting that from the damage you are receiving. The Vagabond's knight armor has a special rule that states the first card you discard this way each time you defend has the block value increased by 1, so we could discard either of these cards and completely block the incoming attack. After discarding any cards in this manner, you also have the option of playing 1 defense card. When you do this, you draw 1 attribute card. If you are in the bottom stand fast line of the combat grid, you draw 2 attribute cards and pick 1 to keep. You then assign the symbols on that attribute card to profile lines on the block card you played. For example, if I decide to play this block card and then I drew this attribute card, I could activate both profile lines, giving me a total block of 3, easily negating the incoming damage. If I drew a card with 2 strength symbols, I could activate the top profile twice for a block of 4. However, if I drew an attribute card that only had a single common symbol on it, I would only be able to activate the second profile once, giving me a block of only 1. In that case, any leftover damage would get through and I would record the health loss on my tri-dial. But in this situation, it makes the most sense to discard my deflect card, which negates 2 damage. But we aren't done. The Vagabond has the special counterattack skill. Whenever he blocks all of the damage from an incoming attack, he can inflict 1 damage on the enemy. So we place a wound token next to the Wolf. The Wolf's activation is over, and now it's the Vagabond's turn. In a standard turn, you get 3 actions from a choice of 7, and you can repeat actions if possible. There are actions like drinking a flask to restore your health or focus, using a consumable item, spending focus to use a spirit ashes, or discarding any 1 card to make a basic attack or to regain 1 focus point. However, most commonly, you are going to move into an orthogonally adjacent space, play one card from your hand, or draw from your combat deck up to your hand limit. We want to put this wolf down, so we are going to make a move action to transition into an offensive stance. Then we are going to play a combat card. We are going to use our fanciest move, Heavy Strike. We can see from the attack pattern on the top half of the card that this move will hit the first enemy in our lane, and the wolf is indeed in our lane. The top half of the card also indicates that if we can activate the profile with a strength attribute, we can spend one focus point to add stagger to the attack. Stagger prevents an enemy from moving on its next turn, but is particularly useful against bosses where if you accumulate enough stagger on them, you trigger special rules unique to each boss. Normally, when you play an attack card, you draw one attribute card. However, our Vagabond is in a critical hit row, so we'll draw two. Furthermore, in its fury, the wolf has advanced into its own critical hit row, so I draw 3 cards and keep the best one. The first card I draw is a single common symbol. Not good enough. We can see that a common symbol will either inflict 1 wound or push the wolf 1 space. The second card I draw is a single strength icon. That's better. It would inflict 1 wound and a push, as the 2 icons aren't separated by a vertical line. Furthermore, we could trigger that stagger ability. However, the third card we draw is 3 common symbols, which means I can trigger the bottom attack profile 3 times. That's 3 wounds, and the wolf is dead. We remove the miniature from the grid, and its card from the initiative order. We still have 1 action left. We know the Godric soldier is going to come for us next, so we use our action to move 1 space to the right. Now the Godric soldier activates. The top row of his card shows that he will move 1 space left or right towards the closest Tarnished. If he can't do that for any reason, his way is blocked by other models for example, he will instead advance 1 space forwards. As he is alone and free to move to the right, he does so. He then attempts to strike the first Tarnished in his row for 3 damage, but of course, we moved out of the way, and he misses. And that completes the round of combat. Initiative cards are reshuffled, and on your next turn, you will play the second round. Of course, this is just a very basic example. Later on, enemies have much more sophisticated attack patterns, and they can inflict bleed, stagger, and poison. They will also have more advanced abilities on their rows, like powerful attacks that can't be blocked, and armor that negates incoming damage. But I think you get the idea. Having completed first steps, you get a new map card. It unlocks another narrative scenario where you will meet your first NPC. However, you also get 10 runes, your first runes of the game. All Tarnished acquire runes at the same rate, and in addition to being necessary for accessing rune-locked map cards, they are useful for upgrading your character in several different ways. You can upgrade your starting equipment. Each item has an upgrade cost at the bottom. If you have enough runes, you can search the armor for the upgraded version and equip that, which lets you alter your combat deck. You could pay to add a trait to your character. These are small buffs to help shore up any deficit in your character build. An extra health point early on goes a long way. You could also buy new attribute cards to adapt your attribute deck. And if you have found new weapons, armor, talismans, or memories, which are spells that can be attached to weapons that have a suitable memory slot, you can pay to equip those. One of the coolest things is you can respec whenever you want. Runes aren't actually spent when you use them, they are just allocated to a particular purpose, and whenever you unequip the item or remove the card from your deck, you get the full value of the runes back. It gives you a lot of freedom to adapt your character based on what you have found or how you would like to play. Anyway, having spent your new runes, I recommend getting a new attribute card, you go on your narrative adventure, at the end of which you are approached by a menacing figure, because your next scenario is an early trial, your first encounter with a fearsome boss, the Tree Sentinel. Boss battles work in exactly the same way as regular combat encounters, except you create the battle grid using all 4 encounter books, so you have a much larger area to work with. And rather than having a single initiative card, bosses have a deck of initiative cards, and they get to add a certain amount of cards from that deck to the initiative row each round. This means the boss is going to act multiple times per round, and you won't know exactly what they are going to do. The first boss battle did knock my Vagabond around a little bit. Fortunately, you don't have to defeat the Tree Sentinel, just fend him off long enough to escape by staggering him 3 times. My Vagabond did get reduced to 0 health twice before being able to apply enough stagger effects to win, but I had Stakes of Marika that let me stay in the game, and so I won. Escaping the Tree Sentinel unlocked the next exploration stage, and from there I was able to unlock several paths to continue my adventure, experiencing gauntlets, which are combat encounters where new enemies are added to the grid each turn, and dungeons, which are gauntlets with a boss at the end of them. And every one of those fights was fun. But combat is a puzzle. There is randomness in your card pools and the order of the initiative cards, but skill outweighs luck. That's great, but a puzzle can be solved. And I think something has clicked with me, because I don't find the combat all that difficult. It makes me think, I have to carefully ponder my moves to make sure I am making the best choices. I can't just breeze through with my brain in neutral, but because I am carefully pondering my moves, because I can figure out where each enemy will go and what they will do, I always win. At the time of writing this review, I have never lost a combat encounter. I've been reduced to 0 health multiple times, but as long as you have a stake of Marika, you simply discard the stake and revive, ready to continue the fight. Only 3 times have I been really on the ropes. That initial fight with the Tree Sentinel, the first time imps turned up and I realised they aren't very easy to hit, and a particularly nasty encounter with bosses that had a tendency to hide in the shadows. Is that a problem? I don't know. The combats are really fun and I have enjoyed solving each one, and maybe it shouldn't be the case that every single fight drags you through the mud. If you can solve the puzzle, you should be rewarded by completing the scenario without taking a hammering. And in fairness, even if you do get beaten, you are just supposed to pick yourself up, dust yourself down and play that scenario again, or play a different scenario to level up a bit first before having another go. So maybe it's not an issue. Admittedly, the fights have been getting tougher. Perhaps the difficulty just hasn't ramped as quickly as I would have expected, or else I have managed to level up slightly ahead of the curve. Or maybe I'm playing on easy mode with the solo vagabond. He may not have a massive damage output, but his blocking game is insane, and sometimes you can get into situations where it's impossible to lose because of it. Not wishing to give away too much, but there was one fight in which every time I struck a particular type of enemy with an attack but didn't kill it, a giant bat would spawn onto the combat grid. My solution to that was to allow the enemy to attack me, and then to fully block each attack, which would deflect 1 damage back on them each time. As that damage wasn't classed as an attack, I was safely able to whittle down those enemies to the point where I could comfortably kill them with a single hit, preventing any bats from spawning. Did I break this scenario, or did I just use the tools I had available to effectively solve the puzzle? You decide. Admittedly, this method would not have been possible playing with the Astrologer or Prophet, and to be honest, I'm not convinced either of those characters would be good for solo games, as they are very squishy and cannot consistently perform their strong attacks due to the cost in focus. The Prophet is more of a healer anyway, a supporting character. As I was pondering this, I thought, I know what I can do. If it's possible that playing solo is making the game a bit easy, I will start playing a second character. The really neat thing about how the campaign works is that you can easily add an additional character to the campaign at any time. You simply give them the total number of runes they would have accumulated by playing through the campaign to that point, let them buy any currently available upgrades, and then away you go. So I set up the Astrologer and upgraded them to the level of my Vagabond, and we continued on our quest. I played a few more combats double-handed, and it's not easy. I found it significantly harder to manage than playing Dark Souls with 2 characters, which is actually my preferred way to play that game. Having to juggle multiple decks of cards was a bit much. The experience though was worth it. The nature of combat did change. It was easier for enemies to find a target. You had to think more carefully about how to use stronger characters to protect weaker ones, and with each Tarnished only getting a single activation per combat round, it was harder to play aggressively. There is a massive difference between one character getting 6 actions per turn compared to 2 characters getting only 3 actions per turn. However, after a bumpy start, I adapted to the new challenge and continued to win. Often it was possible to use the Vagabond as a shield for the Astrologer, as many enemies will only hit the first Tarnished in their lane. Although, do watch out for the ones that hit every Tarnished in their lane, that can really catch you off guard. And the magic the Astrologer possesses lets you string attacks together as a single action, making it possible to clear out more enemies in a single turn than the Vagabond can. Eventually, I dropped the Astrologer and went back to playing just the Vagabond, as I wasn't enjoying playing 2 characters at once and I wanted to move faster through the campaign to see what happened next. And then, just for the heck of it, and to see how he played, I swapped out the Vagabond for the Samurai. And the Samurai is awesome. He combines movement with attacks, so while he often doesn't do a lot of damage per attack, he can make more attacks per round. Often he is allowed to move after attacking, so you can afford to take one extra swing at an enemy knowing you will probably be able to duck out of harm's way afterwards. He plays completely differently to the Vagabond or Astrologer, and I had to learn how to fight all over again. And yes, in his first outing, he got knocked down to 0 hit points more than once, but I always had enough stakes in Marika to keep on trucking. And still, I was always able to win. I really enjoyed my time with the Samurai, but I am a chonky knight at heart, so eventually I swapped back to the Vagabond, and that is how I have continued forwards. And here I am, around halfway through the campaign. I've played dozens of combats, I've defeated around 7 bosses, I've explored different regions, and I've never failed a scenario yet. And I would be playing the game right now if it wasn't for the fact I had to write this review. Would I have liked to have completed the whole campaign before reviewing the game? Of course, but sometimes with a game like this, it just isn't feasible. There's so much campaign to get through. If I played only this game for another week or two, I still don't think I would be at the end. You really are getting stacks of gameplay, and that's without considering replaying the campaign with different characters, making different choices to unlock different options, and adding in expansion material or playing expansion campaigns. And yes, that does mean I still haven't seen everything the game has to offer. Maybe the very next boss I meet is going to pummel me into a fine red mist. There is always that chance. I also have to add, I haven't really had a chance to see how the game plays with 4 players. The best I could do was set up and run a combat encounter with all 4 heroes using the handy chart in the back of the rules book that provides all the information necessary to run any encounter as a standalone adventure without having to worry about the campaign at all. Again, it was a different experience, and not particularly fun trying to control all of the characters at once, but I muddled through so I can at least say I have seen all 4 of the Tarnished characters in action and have seen how they interact with each other on the battlefield. I still have a lot more adventuring to do, but for now, I need to sum up. Elden Ring: Realm of the Grafted King is a monumental achievement, an admirable attempt to translate a massive video game into a tabletop experience. It's as much a story as it is a game, and in my playthrough I have enjoyed it as a big interactive novel, a rip-roaring adventure in a strange land that isn't particularly challenging but offers enough entertainment to feel worth exploring. I have enjoyed seeing how my decisions shape the world, reading through the narrative quests, exploring new regions of the map, and puzzling my puzzler till my puzzler is sore, defeating all kinds of enemies. And when I'm not playing the game, I am thinking about the game. And so, ultimately, I think Elden Ring does what it sets out to do. It's grand in scale, cleverly designed, and intricately constructed. For fans of fantasy adventure, there is lots to love here. I still have no idea where I'm going to store the box though. Oh, and I do have to mention again the miniatures. If you are a painter, a collector, someone who plays something like D&D, or just a fan of Elden Ring, you are going to get a kick out of the miniatures. Don't forget, I will be doing a separate video for them next week. Note that Elden Ring is available for pre-order now. In the video description below, you will find a link to the Steamforged Games web store where you can check out all of the products from the range and learn more about what it's like to adventure in the lands between. A huge thanks to Steamforged Games for sending this early review copy to the channel, and if you have stuck it out to this point, thank you for watching. If you like the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really like the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so, and hopefully I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.